The first sign of trouble was the smoke. It wasn't the friendly white smoke of a neighbor's campfire. This was a greasy black pillar clawing its way into the bleached blue New Mexico sky. It was the kind of smoke that meant something man-made was dying, something that wasn't supposed to burn. Henry Whitmore saw it from his corral. He dropped the hammer he was using to fix a split rail, the clang lost in the vast, empty silence of the high desert. His dog, Rex, a border collie with more sense than most men, was already at the edge of the porch, hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Rex knew that smoke, too. They'd both seen it before, in another life, a life of uniforms and bugle calls and the bitter smell of war. The smoke was rising from the south, from the direction of the Clearwater Valley. That's where the Murphy family lived. A cold knot tightened in Henry's gut. Patrick Murphy, his wife Catherine, and their 3 small children. Good people, honest people who had come west with nothing but hope and the sweat on their backs. They were 2 years into building their dream, a little homestead carved out of the unforgiving land. Now that black smoke was rising right from the heart of it. Henry didn't hesitate. He didn't waste time wondering. In this country, wondering got you killed. He strode into the cool adobe house, the silence inside a heavy blanket. His boots echoed on the wooden floors, a lonely sound in a home built for 2. He reached above the stone fireplace and took down his Winchester. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, an extension of his arm, its cool metal a grim comfort. He worked the lever, checked the chamber, and slid cartridges into the magazine until it was full. The metallic clicks were the only sounds in the room. He strapped his gun belt around his waist, settling the Colt 45 on his hip. Rex whined at the door, his anxiety a palpable thing. "Easy, boy," Henry murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Stay here. Guard the house." The dog seemed to understand, sinking onto the porch with a final mournful look. Outside, the sun was a hammer. Henry saddled his best horse, a powerful buckskin named Thunder, who seemed to sense the urgency in his master's movements. He didn't push the horse into a gallop. That would exhaust him before they got halfway there. Instead, he settled into a steady, ground-eating pace, a rhythm born of long miles and desperate rides. The landscape blurred into a smear of sagebrush, prickly pear, and sun-baked rock. The ride was nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of silence with only the pounding of hooves and the rising column of smoke ahead. His mind raced with grim possibilities. Apache raids were rare these days, but not unheard of. More likely it was outlaws, cattle rustlers, army deserters, the human refuse that drifted through the territory like tumbleweeds. Patrick had recently sold some cattle in Santa Fe. Word of a homesteader with cash traveled fast. As he got closer, the smell hit him. The sharp, acrid stench of burned wood, of cooked meat, of something else. Something sickeningly sweet that made his stomach turn. Thunder snorted, his ears twitching, nostrils flaring at the scent of death. Henry reined him in at the top of the ridge overlooking the Murphy homestead. He swung down from the saddle, his rifle in his hand, and crawled the last few feet on his belly. He peered over the ridge, and his blood ran cold. The homestead wasn't just burned, it was annihilated. The house was a heap of blackened timbers and collapsed stone, the chimney standing like a lonely tombstone. The barn was a skeletal ruin. Dead cattle were scattered across the yard, their bodies bloated in the heat, already attracting the first circling buzzards. It was a scene of total, senseless destruction. But it was the stillness that was the worst, the absolute lack of life. Then he saw them, near the well. 3 shapes sprawled in the dust. Even from a distance he knew. He knew what they were. 2 adults, 1 child. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread. This wasn't a raid. A raid was for profit. Indians or rustlers would have taken the livestock, the tools, anything of value. This was an execution. They hadn't just come to steal, they had come to erase. For 10 long minutes, Henry lay on that ridge, his eyes scanning every shadow, every rock. He listened. The only sounds were the crackle of the last dying embers and the whisper of the hot wind. The killers were gone. Satisfied, he stood up, his joints cracking, and led Thunder down the dusty slope into the valley of death. The closer he got, the worse it was. The hard work, the dreams, all turned to ash. He walked past the dead cattle, his gaze fixed on the figures by the well. He had to be sure. He had to know. He reached the first body, Patrick Murphy. Face down in the dirt, a dark stain spreading across the back of his work shirt. A few feet away lay Catherine, her arms outstretched, as if she'd been trying to crawl to her husband or to her child. And then he saw the third body, the small one, and Henry's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a wave of nausea, of pure, untamed rage. Little Danny Murphy, 6 years old, a bright, curious boy with a mess of dark hair and his mother's green eyes. He was curled on his side, his small clothes torn and stained. Henry knelt, his movements slow, his mind numb. He reached out a trembling hand to close the boy's eyes. He had to do something. He couldn't just leave them here for the vultures. As his fingers brushed the child's cheek, he felt it. A flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement of an eyelid. His heart stopped. He leaned closer, his ear pressed to the boy's chest. And he heard it, a faint, shallow, rattling breath. The boy was alive. "Easy there, son," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "You're safe now. I'm here." He gently rolled the child onto his back. The wound was bad. A gunshot to the chest, high up, but it was a miracle the boy was breathing at all. His face was as white as bone, his lips a pale blue. Henry had seen that look 100 times on the battlefield. He knew what it meant. Danny's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion. For a moment he just stared up at the sky. Then his gaze found Henry's face. A flicker of recognition. A ghost of a smile. Mr. Henry." The voice was a bare whisper, weaker than a dry leaf skittering across the ground. "That's right, Danny. It's me." Henry forced a reassuring smile, trying to keep the horror from his own eyes. "Everything's going to be all right." He knew it was a lie. They were hours from a doctor, and the boy was fading fast. But he was the only comfort this child had left in the world. He couldn't let him die alone in the dust next to his murdered parents. Henry carefully lifted the boy. He was terrifyingly light. He carried him to the shade of a lone juniper tree that had somehow survived the fire and laid him gently on a blanket from his saddlebag. Where are Mama and Papa?" Danny asked, his small, dirt-caked hand weakly clutching Henry's shirt. Henry's throat closed up. The words wouldn't come. How could he tell him? How could he break this little boy's heart in his final moments? "Don't you worry about that now, son," he said, his voice thick. "You just rest." Danny's green eyes, so much like his mother's, seemed to clear for a moment. An urgency burned in them, a fire that pushed back the encroaching darkness. "Mr. Henry, I need you to do something for me." "Anything, Danny. Anything you need." The boy's voice grew even fainter. Henry had to lean in close, his ear almost touching the child's lips. If I don't make it, you have to find my mama. You have to find her and tell her something." Henry frowned in confusion. "Danny, your mother..." He couldn't say it. He couldn't tell him Catherine was gone. But the boy shook his head, a tiny pained movement. "No, not her. My real mama." His gaze was unwavering. "The one in my drawing." He was making no sense. Delirious. But the intensity in his eyes was real. It was the most real thing in this whole nightmare. "What do you want me to tell her, son?" Henry asked gently, deciding to play along, to give the boy whatever peace he could. Danny's grip tightened with a surprising surge of strength. Tell her I love her. Tell her I was brave. I tried to protect my sisters." His voice broke, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "And tell her I'm sorry. I couldn't save them." "Oh, Danny," Henry's own voice was choked with tears. "You don't have anything to be sorry for. You're a little boy. This wasn't your fault." "I hid," the boy whispered, the words ragged. "When the bad men came, I heard Mama screaming, but I was scared. I hid under the porch, like a coward." "That wasn't cowardly, son. That was smart. Your parents would have wanted you to be safe. Henry's heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Danny's breathing was becoming more shallow, each breath a struggle. His eyes were fixed on Henry's face. Promise me, Mr. Henry. Promise you'll find her. The lady in the drawing. My real mama. Promise you'll tell her. I said goodbye. It was the plea of a dying soul, a sacred trust. It didn't matter if it made sense. I promise, Danny, Henry said, his voice firm. I'll find her. I'll tell her everything you said. A look of peace washed over the boy's pale features. His grip on Henry's shirt relaxed. Thank you, he whispered. I knew you would. Catherine, she always said you were the best man in the whole territory. The sun beat down. The buzzards circled higher. Henry held the small, cold hand, whispering words of comfort as the boy's life ebbed away. As the sky began to bleed into the purples and oranges of sunset, Danny's eyes opened one last time. They were clear now, focused. Tell Mama. The whisper was so faint Henry barely caught it. Tell her I'll wait for her in heaven. And then he was gone. Henry sat there in the growing dusk, holding the boy's still, small body. The silence of the valley was absolute. The weight of his promise settled on his shoulders, heavier than any stone. He had given his word to a dying child. But as he looked out over the smoldering ruins, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The boy hadn't been delirious. There had been a certainty in his eyes, a clarity that defied the fever and the pain. He wasn't talking about Catherine Murphy. He was talking about someone else. And somewhere in the wreckage of this family's life, there had to be a clue. A drawing of a woman no one had ever seen. A woman Henry had just promised a dead boy he would find. He didn't know it then, sitting in the twilight with the world turned to ash around him. But this promise wouldn't just lead him on a search across the territory. It would lead him deep into a past he thought he knew, a past that was about to rise from its grave. Sleep didn't come. For 3 nights, Henry just sat in the dark, the boy's last words echoing in the silence of his empty house. Find my mama, the one in my drawing. He had buried them, all of them. Patrick, Catherine, their 2 little girls, and Danny. He dug the graves himself on a small hill behind their ruined homestead, marking them with rough wooden crosses. It was the least he could do. It was the last thing he could do for the Murphys. But not for Danny. For Danny, there was the promise. The promise was turning into a ghost, haunting his every waking moment. He had ridden out, talking to every neighbor within 50 miles. He'd described the situation, the boy's dying words. They all gave him the same look. Pity, sadness. The polite, gentle suggestion that the boy had been feverish, rambling, confusing his stepmother with his real mother who had likely died in childbirth years ago. It was a sensible explanation, the most likely one, but Henry couldn't shake the image of Danny's eyes, the burning intensity, the absolute certainty. That wasn't delirium, that was truth. On the 3rd morning, before the sun had even crested the eastern mountains, he was in his kitchen, staring at the small, soot-stained wooden box on his table. It held the few things he'd managed to salvage from the ashes of the Murphy home. A small silver locket, tarnished and empty, a few melted coins, and a single piece of paper, folded and singed at the edges. Danny's drawing. He'd looked at it 100 times, but he unfolded it again, his rough fingers gentle. It was a child's drawing, a stick figure family in front of a crooked house. But one figure was drawn with more care than the others. A woman. She was taller than the other figures, with long, flowing dark hair drawn with heavy, deliberate pencil strokes. She wore a blue dress. In her hand, she held a small, purple smudge. A flower, maybe. At the bottom, in a child's careful printing, were the words, Mama and me. The woman looked nothing like Catherine Murphy. Catherine had been a small, fair-haired woman. This woman in the drawing was a ghost, a figment of a dying boy's imagination, a dead end. Henry was about to ride north to Taos, a 3-day journey, to ask around the settlements there. It was a fool's errand, and he knew it. He was chasing a phantom. As he stood to get his saddlebags, Rex started barking from the porch. A visitor. It was Father Miguel Santos, the old priest who had served the territory for 40 years. He was a small, wiry man with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He had married Henry and Margaret. He had buried Margaret. He knew Henry's soul better than Henry did himself. "You look troubled, my friend," the priest said, accepting a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. Henry told him everything. The smoke, the bodies, Danny's final moments, the impossible promise. He pulled out the drawing and laid it on the table between them. Father Miguel listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the simple drawing. He didn't offer platitudes or easy explanations. When Henry was finished, the priest was silent for a long time. Then he leaned forward. "The dying often see things more clearly than the living, Henry," he said, his voice soft. Perhaps the boy knew exactly what he was asking. He picked up the drawing, his old eyes studying it closely. "This dress," he murmured, tracing the lines with a wrinkled finger. "The sleeves, the collar. This is a style from 7, maybe 8 years ago. Quite fashionable. Not the sort of thing a woman would wear on a homestead." Henry had noticed that too, but hadn't thought much of it. "And this," the priest pointed to the purple smudge in the woman's hand. "Look closely. The child has tried to draw a cluster of blossoms. Do you know what flower this is?" Henry squinted. It just looked like a purple blotch. "No idea, Father." "These are lilacs, Henry." The word hit Henry like a physical blow. Lilacs. He felt the air leave his lungs. He looked from the drawing to the small framed portrait on the mantel above the fireplace. The portrait of his wife, Margaret, who had died of tuberculosis 3 years ago. Margaret, who had loved lilacs more than anything. She'd nurtured a small bush by their porch, a fragile splash of color and perfume in the harsh desert. Every spring, she'd filled the house with them. Their sweet scent was the scent of her, the scent of his life with her. "Father, what are you saying?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Father Miguel's eyes were filled with a profound sadness. "I am saying, my friend, that you should look at this drawing again. Look at the woman. The dark hair, the way she holds her head, tilted just so." Henry's hands were shaking as he picked up the drawing. He stared at the crude stick figure. It was impossible. It was a child's scribble. But now that the priest had said it, he could see it. The height, the posture. It was a faint, ghostly echo of the woman he had loved and lost. "But that's impossible," Henry stammered. "Margaret, we never had children. We tried for years. It was the great sorrow of our lives." "Are you certain, Henry?" the priest asked gently. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Certain? He thought he was. But now memories were flooding back. Fragments. Margaret weeping once when she saw him holding a neighbor's baby. The way she would sometimes stare into the distance. An expression of such deep, hidden grief on her face. The small room at the back of the house she had always insisted on keeping as a nursery. Just in case. He had thought it was just wishful thinking. A sad dream she couldn't let go of. But what if it wasn't a dream? What if it was a memory? She spent time in Santa Fe before we met, Henry said slowly, his mind racing. She said she worked as a seamstress. She never talked much about those years. "Henry," the priest said, his voice grave, "sometimes people carry secrets not to deceive, but to protect themselves, and to protect the ones they love." The implication was a lightning strike, shattering everything Henry thought he knew. A child. A child Margaret had before they met. A son she had to give up. A son who would be 6 or 7 years old. Danny's age. He felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. The woman he had shared his life with, the woman he thought he knew completely, had carried a secret of this magnitude. A pain so deep she had buried it under years of silence. "If this is true," Henry said, his voice barely a whisper, "she died without ever seeing him again." "But perhaps," Father Miguel said softly, "through you she still can." Her son's final message. "Perhaps he chose you for a reason, Henry. Perhaps in his heart he knew." Henry stumbled over to the small bookshelf where Margaret kept her things. Her favorite books, a collection of pressed flowers, and a leather-bound journal. He had never opened it. He had respected her privacy, even in death. Now with trembling hands he took it down. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Margaret's, neat and elegant, and the date was from a year before he had met her. His heart pounded as he began to read. May 15th, 1875. I have made the most difficult decision of my life. My sweet boy, I cannot give him the life he deserves. The family is good and kind. They have promised to love him, but a part of my soul goes with him today. I pray he will understand someday. I pray he will know that his mother loved him enough to let him go. Henry's vision blurred with tears. He kept reading, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the book. June 1st, 1875. I have named him Daniel after my father. He has the most beautiful green eyes, just like his father. He deserves more than a mother with a shameful secret and a name no one will speak. Daniel. Danny. The journal entries went on for pages, a river of grief and love. And then, a final entry about the boy, dated just a few weeks before Margaret had met Henry. October 3rd, 1876. I have received word. My Daniel is with a good family, the Murphys, in the Clearwater Valley. They call him Danny now. They say he is happy. Perhaps now I can finally try to build a new life. Perhaps that is the last gift I can give him. To let him be loved, and to carry my secret to the grave. Henry closed the journal. The truth was a physical weight crushing the air from his lungs. All those years, all those quiet nights and shared smiles. She had been living with this. A son, just a few days' ride away. A son she watched from a distance, her heart breaking a little more each day. He looked up at Father Miguel, whose eyes were filled with compassion. Then Henry walked to the fireplace and stood before Margaret's portrait. He looked into her smiling eyes, frozen in time on their wedding day. He finally understood. The promise wasn't impossible. It was his destiny. He had been chosen. Tell Mama I love her one last time, he whispered, the words spoken not just from his own lips, but from Danny's. He loves you, Margaret, Henry said to the portrait, the tears flowing freely now. Our boy, he loves you. He was brave, and he's waiting for you in heaven. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The promise was kept. The message was delivered. But as the relief washed over him, it was replaced by something else, a cold, hard certainty. The journal had mentioned something else. It mentioned Danny's biological father, a man from a wealthy, powerful family back east who had abandoned Margaret when she became pregnant. A family that had wanted the scandal and the child to simply disappear. Henry walked back to the smoldering ruins of the Murphy homestead in his mind. He saw the scene again, the senseless destruction, the fact that nothing was stolen. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a cleanup, an extermination. They hadn't just come for the Murphys. They had come for the boy, to erase the last living evidence of a powerful man's mistake. Henry's grief began to cool, hardening into something else, something solid and unyielding. It hardened into rage. The promise wasn't finished. Delivering the message was only half of it. Danny had been brave. He had tried to protect his family. Now someone had to get justice for him. Henry went back to his gun cabinet. He took out a box of cartridges for the Winchester. He took out another for the Colt. His hands were steady now. His purpose was clear. Father Miguel watched him, his expression grim. What are you going to do, Henry? Henry turned, his blue-gray eyes as hard as chips of flint. I'm going to keep the second half of my promise, he said. I'm going to find the men who did this, and I'm going to make them sorry they were ever born. The search for a mother was over. The hunt for a monster had just begun. Justice isn't a feeling, it's a trail. It's tracks in the dust, a drop button, a careless word in a saloon. And Henry Whitmore knew how to read a trail. The cavalry had taught him that. The Apache had taught him better. He went back to the Murphy place. The buzzards scattered as he approached, their ugly work interrupted. The smell was worse now, a thick, suffocating blanket of decay. But Henry ignored it. He wasn't there for the dead anymore. He was there for the clues the killers had left behind. He started with the tracks. Most were shod with standard Army-issue horseshoes, common as dirt. But there was one set, faint but clear near the burned-out barn, that was different. A custom shoe. On the left forefoot, There was a small, distinctive notch cut into the iron, a farrier's mark, or maybe a fix for a horse with a cracked hoof. It was a tiny detail, but it was everything. A needle in a haystack of a territory. He circled the property, his eyes scanning the ground. Near the spot where Patrick Murphy had fallen, something glinted in the dirt. He knelt and brushed away the dust. It was a button. Not a simple wooden or bone button from a frontiersman's shirt. This one was ornate, made of polished brass, with an eagle insignia stamped into it. It wasn't cavalry. He knew every uniform button from the last 20 years. This was different, more refined. The kind of thing you'd see on a fancy blazer or a duster worn by a man with money. A man with money. Like the family Margaret had written about in her journal. The wealthy Eastern clan who had cast her and her son aside. Her journal hadn't named them. She had only referred to them as the Lions of Philadelphia. A pride of lions, she'd written, with hearts of stone, one notched horseshoe, one brass button, a name without a face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He rode to the town of Esperanza first. It was little more than a dusty street with a saloon, a general store, and a sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man named Cobb with a drooping mustache and a belly that spilled over his gun belt, listened to Henry's story with a bored expression. "Raiders, you say?" Cobb grunted, leaning back in his chair so far it creaked in protest. "Happens. Bunch of Comancheros hit a stagecoach north of here last month. Probably the same fellas." "They didn't steal anything," Henry said, his voice level. "They just killed them. All of them. And one of the horses had a notched shoe." Cobb shrugged. "Lots of horses, lots of shoes. Look, Whitmore, I'll put the word out. But don't get your hopes up. This is rough country. People die. That's the way of it." Henry looked at the sheriff, at his lazy eyes and his soft hands. He was a man who collected a salary and kept the peace inside the town limits. He wasn't a man who chased ghosts for a dead boy. Henry knew right then he was on his own. He walked out of the office without another word. He started at the livery stables. He asked every farrier, every stable hand, every traveler passing through about the notched horseshoe. Most just shook their heads. But one old blacksmith, a man named Jedediah with arms like tree trunks, paused in his work. "Notched shoe on the left forefoot?" he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, I seen that. 'Bout a week ago. 3 men rode through, headed east. One of 'em, his horse had a shoe just like that. I offered to fix it for him, but he told me to mind my own business. Real friendly fella." "Did you see which way they went?" Henry asked, his pulse quickening. "Like I said, east, towards the Staked Plains. Ain't nothing out there but heat and bad news. East." That was the direction, back towards civilization, back towards Philadelphia. They were running. He bought supplies at the general store. Jerky, hardtack, and a box of 4440 cartridges for the Winchester. As he paid, he placed the brass button on the counter. "Ever see a button like this?" The storekeeper picked it up, squinting. "Can't say I have. Too fancy for around here. Looks like something a Pinkerton man or a railroad detective might wear." A Pinkerton, a private detective, hired muscle. The pieces were starting to fit. A wealthy family, a private detective agency, and a job to erase a problem. It made a cold, brutal kind of sense. For 2 weeks, Henry rode east. The landscape changed from high desert to the vast, featureless plains of the Llano Estacado. The Staked Plains, a sea of grass under an endless sky. It was a place where a man could get lost forever. He pushed on, following the faint trail, checking watering holes for that distinctive hoof print. He found it twice, each time a confirmation that he was on the right path. He rode into small fly-speck towns, asking his questions, showing the button. He got the same answers. 3 men, quiet, kept to themselves, paid in cash, always heading east. They were moving fast, but Henry was relentless. He slept in the saddle, ate on the move, and let the fire of his promise burn away his exhaustion. In a dusty town in the Texas Panhandle, he got his next break. A saloon girl remembered the men. She especially remembered one of them. "He was a talker," she said, her eyes distant, full of himself. "Bragged about a big job they just finished in New Mexico. Said they were getting paid a fortune by some rich old man back in Philly to tie up a loose end, he called it. She shivered. He had dead eyes. The kind that don't see you, they just see what you're worth. Did he say a name? Henry asked, his hand tight on his coffee cup. He said they worked for a man named Lion, said the old man was powerful as a king. Lion, the name from Margaret's journal. It was real. This wasn't a phantom chase anymore. He had a name. The trail led him out of Texas and into Indian territory. It was a lawless place, a refuge for outlaws and fugitives. Here the trail went cold. The men could have gone in 100 different directions. Henry spent a week riding from one desolate outpost to another, his frustration growing with every empty lead. He was about to give up, to turn back, when he stumbled upon a small, burned-out trading post. An old trapper was sitting amidst the ruins, cleaning his rifle. He told Henry a band of outlaws had raided the post a few days earlier. 3 of them. They were arguing, the trapper said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. The leader, a big fellow with a fancy button on his coat, was mad at one of the others. Said he was a drunk and a liability. They had a falling out. The big fella and his other partner rode north, left the drunk one behind. Where did he go? Henry asked. Stumbled off south toward the Red River, probably looking for a bottle. Henry changed direction. He wasn't hunting 3 men anymore. He was hunting one, the weak link. He rode south, and 2 days later, he found him. He was in a makeshift camp by the river, passed out with a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. Henry dismounted, his Winchester in his hands. He kicked the bottle, sending it spinning into the river. The man jolted awake, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He scrambled for his pistol, but Henry was faster. The butt of the Winchester came down hard on the man's wrist, and he screamed as the bone snapped. We need to talk, Henry said, his voice as cold as a grave. He tied the man to a tree. He let him sweat. He let him beg. He let him feel the terror the Murphys must have felt. Then as the sun went down, Henry pulled the brass button from his pocket and held it in front of the man's face. I believe this is he said. The man's face went white. He started babbling, spilling the whole story in a torrent of fear. The name of the man who hired them was Marcus Lyon, the grandfather. He'd hired them through a shady security firm to find the boy and remove the problem. He'd paid them $10,000. It wasn't supposed to be like that, the man whimpered. We were just supposed to take the kid, make him disappear. But our leader, a man named Silas, he's a psycho. He said leaving witnesses was messy. He said the old man would pay more for a clean job. He was sobbing now, snot and tears running down his face. I didn't kill the kid, I swear. It was Silas. He shot the boy. Where are they? Henry's voice was dangerously quiet. They were headed for Kansas, the man blubbered, to a rail town called Dodge City, to pick up the rest of their pay. Henry looked at the whimpering coward tied to the tree. He thought of Danny. He thought of his parents. He thought of the 2 little girls. He pulled his Colt, the hammer clicking back with a sound like a breaking bone. The man's eyes widened in terror. Wait! You can't! I told you everything! You did, Henry said, and I thank you for it. He holstered the pistol. But justice doesn't always come from the barrel of a gun. He took out his knife. He cut the man's bonds. Get on your horse and ride, he said. But I'm taking your guns and your water. It's a 3-day ride to the nearest town. If you make it, you get to live with what you've done. The man scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, a pathetic figure disappearing into the twilight. Henry knew he wouldn't survive a day. The prairie would deliver its own kind of justice. Now he had a destination, Dodge City, a place notorious for its gunslingers, its gamblers, and its lawlessness. A perfect place for men like Silas to hide. Henry rode north. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a wraith, a grim reaper riding a pale horse. He was coming for Silas, and he was bringing hell with him. Dodge City was a festering sore on the face of the prairie, a chaotic jumble of saloons, brothels, and gambling dens. It roared with the sound of piano music, drunken laughter, and the occasional gunshot. It was a city built on the deadly combination of cattle money and desperation, and it was the perfect place to disappear. But Henry wasn't there to disappear. He was there to find someone. He stabled Thunder and walked down the dusty main street, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. Men eyed him as he passed, their gazes hard and assessing. He looked like what he was, a man from the territories, weathered and worn, but with an edge that most city dwellers lacked. His eyes were what gave him away. They weren't looking at the sights. They were scanning, searching, hunting. He started with the banks. Marcus Lyon would have to wire the final payment somewhere. There were 2 banks in Dodge. At the first, he got nothing but suspicious stares. But at the second, a clerk, a young man with a nervous twitch, recognized the name. "Mr. Silas is expecting a wire transfer, yes," the clerk said, refusing to meet Henry's gaze. "He comes in every day to check on it." "When do you expect him?" Henry asked, his voice calm and low. "Usually around noon." It was 11:30. Henry thanked the clerk and walked out of the bank. He found a spot across the street in the deep shadow of an overhang, and he waited. He was good at waiting. The army had taught him patience. The desert had perfected it. He stood perfectly still, just another dusty figure leaning against a post, blending into the chaos of the street. At 5 minutes past noon, 2 men pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Long Branch Saloon and started across the street towards the bank. One was a nondescript man with a nervous look. The other was big. He walked with a swagger, his hand resting on a pearl-handled revolver strapped to his hip. He wore a long, dark duster, and even from across the street, Henry could see the glint of brass on the collar. A single brass button was missing. It was him, Silas, the man with the dead eyes, the man who had shot a 6-year-old boy. A cold calm settled over Henry. The rage was still there, a burning coal in his gut, but it was controlled now, focused to a single, deadly point. He let them walk into the bank. He didn't want to shoot out in the street with innocent people in the way. He would handle this his way. He waited a few minutes, then followed them inside. The bank was quiet. The clerk who had helped him was nowhere to be seen. Another teller stood behind the cage, his face pale. Silas and his partner were at the counter, their backs to the door. "I'm telling you, the wire hasn't arrived yet," the teller was saying, his voice trembling. "It was supposed to be here yesterday," Silas growled. "Old man Lyon better not be trying to cheat me." "That's far enough," Henry said from the door. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet room like a razor. Both men spun around. Their hands flew to their guns. "Don't," Henry said, his own Colt already in his hand, steady as a rock. "I'm not here to rob the bank." His eyes were locked on Silas. "I'm here for you." Silas stared at him, his face a mixture of confusion and arrogance. "Do I know you, friend?" "You killed a family in New Mexico," Henry said. "A man named Murphy, his wife, his children." Recognition flickered in Silas's eyes, quickly replaced by a sneer. "That was just business, nothing personal." "The boy's name was Danny," Henry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He was 6 years old. That was personal to me." The other man, the nervous one, started to raise his pistol. Henry didn't even seem to move. The Colt bucked in his hand, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. The nervous man grunted, a red flower blooming on his chest, and collapsed to the floor. Silas was faster. His pearl-handled revolver was out and firing. A bullet splintered the door frame next to Henry's head. Henry dived to the side, rolling behind a heavy wooden desk as another shot rang out. The bank teller screamed and ducked behind the counter. Henry came up firing. He put 2 shots into the counter where Silas was hiding. Wood chips flew. Silas cursed and fired back blindly. This was a fool's game, a standoff. Henry knew he had to end it. "You came all this way for a dirt farmer's kid?" Silas taunted from behind the counter. "You got a death wish, old man." "I made a promise," Henry called back. He took a deep breath. He could hear Silas reloading, the clicks of the cartridges being slotted into the cylinder. It was now or never. Henry burst from behind the desk, not at Silas, but towards the teller's cage. He vaulted over the low gate, landing in a crouch beside the terrified teller. He now had a new angle. Silas, surprised by the move, stood up to fire. But Henry was ready. He fired once. The bullet caught Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around. The pearl-handled revolver clattered to the floor. Henry stood up and walked slowly towards him, his Colt aimed at Silas's head. Silas was clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in pain and rage. "You should have just taken the boy," Henry said, his voice devoid of emotion. It would have been cleaner. The old man wanted it clean, Silas spat, blood dripping from his lips. No witnesses. No loose ends. You're the loose end now, Henry said. Suddenly, the doors of the bank flew open. The town marshal and two deputies burst in, shotguns leveled. Drop it, mister! The marshal yelled. Henry didn't even look at them. His eyes were locked on Silas. This man murdered a family, 4 of them, including 3 children. He's lying, Silas screamed. He tried to rob the bank. Henry slowly, deliberately lowered his pistol and placed it on the floor. He raised his hands. He knew how this looked, but he had one more card to play. In his coat pocket, Henry said to the marshal, you'll find a telegram. It's confirmation of a $10,000 payment from a Mr. Marcus Lyon of Philadelphia. Payment for a job in New Mexico. One of the deputies cautiously approached Silas and pulled a folded piece of paper from his duster pocket. He read it, and his eyes went wide. He showed it to the marshal. The marshal read the telegram, then looked at the dead man on the floor, and then at the wounded, snarling Silas. He finally looked at Henry, a new respect in his eyes. Put him in cuffs, the marshal said, nodding at Silas. Justice. It wasn't clean, it wasn't pretty, but it was done. They held Henry for 2 days while they wired the authorities in New Mexico. Sheriff Cobb himself had to send a telegram confirming Henry's story and the massacre at the Murphy homestead. The wire from Marcus Lyon was all the proof they needed. Silas was headed for a hangman's noose, and Marcus Lyon, the powerful man in Philadelphia, would soon be getting a visit from federal marshals. His world of secrets and lies was about to come crashing down. The marshal released Henry. You did the law's job for it, he said, handing Henry back his Colt. I'm not sure I approve of your methods, but I can't argue with the results. Henry didn't say anything. He just nodded, took his gun, and walked out into the dusty street. His promise was fulfilled. The message had been delivered. The debt had been paid in full. He rode out of Dodge City that afternoon, heading west, back towards the silence and the solitude of his ranch, back to the graves on the hill. He had 2 stories to tell them now, a story of love and a story of justice. 5 years passed. The raw wound of that August day slowly scarred over, as all wounds do, but it never fully disappeared. It became a part of Henry, a part of the landscape of his soul. He never remarried. Margaret was the love of his life, and the discovery of her secret had only deepened that love, making it more complex, more tragic, and more profound. He understood her now in a way he never had when she was alive. He made a change to the graves on the hill overlooking his ranch. He had Margaret's body moved from the town cemetery and reburied her on his land. He erected 2 new headstones, carved from fine granite he'd had brought all the way from Santa Fe. One read, Margaret Whitmore, beloved wife. Beside it stood a smaller stone, Daniel Danny Murphy, beloved son. Tell Mama I love her. He hadn't stopped there. He sold off most of his cattle and used the money, along with the reward money he'd unexpectedly received for the capture of Silas's gang, to build a small schoolhouse near his home. He hired a teacher from back east and opened it to all the children from the scattered homesteads in the territory. It was a place of laughter and learning, a testament to the future in a land so often defined by its violent past. He did it for Danny, the boy who would never get to grow up. In the space beside the main house, where the sun was gentlest, he planted a garden according to a plan he found in the back of Margaret's journal. It was her dream garden, the one she had sketched out for the day when Danny comes home. And in the center of that garden, he planted lilac bushes. They thrived in the dry desert soil, as if nurtured by the love that had dreamed them into being. Every spring, they bloomed in a riot of purple, their sweet fragrance drifting on the wind, a scent of memory and peace. Father Miguel still visited, his hair now completely white, his steps a little slower. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, the silence between them comfortable and deep. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the mountains in hues of gold and rose, the priest turned to him. You found peace, Henry. It wasn't a question. Henry looked out at the garden, at the lilac blossoms trembling in the evening breeze. I kept my promise, he said quietly. That's all a man can do. He had delivered a message from a son to his mother across the veil of death. He had brought justice for their murders. He had turned a legacy of pain and secrets into a future of hope for the children of the territory. And sometimes, on quiet nights like this, when the wind whispered through the sagebrush and stirred the sweet scent of the lilacs, he could almost hear it, a faint, happy whisper carried on the breeze, the voice of a little boy. "Thank you, Mr. Henry. Thank you for telling Mama I love her." The story of Danny Murphy became a quiet legend in that corner of the world, a tale of a love that could not be broken by distance or death, and of a promise that had echoed through eternity. If you were moved by Henry's journey and his unbreakable promise, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more stories that dig deep into the heart of the Old West, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one. Let me know in the comments below. What was the most powerful moment in this story for you? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.